Look out, heavy firepower inbound from the sky. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're planning on unleashing a drop pod full of Devastators and talking about some of the best configurations and combos when you're thinking of hitting the opponent with first turn grav cannons or multi-melters. Drop pod grav cannon Devastators do seem to be a bit of a recurring theme over the editions in 40k. They were crazily powerful in 7th as part of the Skyhammer Annihilation Force, found massive success again as soon as that grav amplification stratagem came out in the previous Codex Space Marines, and despite that being gone, still have some interesting options in 9th. So in general, Devastators are one of the more interesting units to put in a drop pod, as drop pods are quite expensive, so you really want to be loading in some very heavy firepower into it to really make it worth it. Out of the options available to them, there's not really all that much point putting heavy bolters, plasma cannons or las cannons in there. They all have decent range, and in general I think you're better off just starting them on the board and buying more Devastators instead of giving yourself a drop pod. The options that I'm most interested in are the grav cannon and the multi-melter. Grav cannons will spit out 4 shots at strength 5, AP -3 and damage 2 against anything with a 3-up armor save. Very good at anti-heavy infantry and particularly countering other space marines. Multi-melters, since the melter buff, have got 2 shots now and a far more efficient anti-tank than las cannons if you can get them in range. I typically think about taking a minimum sized squad of Devastators with 5 models and 1 Armorium Cherub to allow you to shoot one of the guns twice. The Sergeant will have his Signum to allow one Devastator to hit even more accurately, which typically will be the one that's firing twice, and if you really wanted even more firepower you could consider an extra combi weapon on the Sergeant, though to be honest I'm not really all that bothered about that. I'd rather just keep the strategy focused on just using the heavy weapons and getting the very most out of them. With 24-inch range on the grav cannons and multi-melters, it means that you can drop them 24 inches away without feeling bad. You can keep them relatively safe while having decent choices of targets, and also deploy out a range of things like Auspex scan, which could be relevant if you're taking variants of this, such as having them come out of strategic reserve or out of deep strike instead. You can invest very heavily in the strategy. One drop pod can of course hold 10 marines, so you could potentially have 2 units of multi-melter or grav devs within the same pod, though it does really start to add up quite a lot. 1 unit of grav devs in a pod is 205 points, 2 is 340, and 1 unit of multi-melters is a really quite pricey 245 points, and 2 is 420. You are paying a lot for this big alpha strike, so it would be very important to get the absolute most out of it. With the grav Devastators, each unit will be putting out 8 shots with the improved ballistic skill from the Signum, and 12 shots without. And for the multi-melter Devastators, you'll be getting 4 shots with improved ballistic skill, and 6 shots without. We'll talk about the damage output after discussing a few combos. To get a bit more out of them, there are plenty of options. You can pay 2 command points to fire as if stationary, which is a stratagem from the core Codex Space Marines. Could maybe be worth it on the pricey multi-melters, but I'm not sure it's the best thing to be building into your list as an inbuilt cost. I think it's far better to use one of the chapter specific options to do that for you. Ultramarines are a pretty good choice for the tactic. You can either drop in on turn 2 or 3 and use Scions of Guilliman to allow you to move and shoot for no penalty, or drop in on turn 1 and use the stratagem to put you in Tactical Doctrine and achieve the same effect. Grav Devastators are a really good target for the Ultramarines Seal of Oath as well, which really will let you focus down one unit excessively. Put a character of some description in the same pod or drop next to one on the field, and the Seal of Oath will get you massive rerolls against one particular target. 4 rerolls to hit and wound for any core units within 6 inches. It's great on both units, though particularly good on Grav Devastators, as it makes them really effective against hard targets as well, that they'd usually be only hitting on 5s. As with the now dead Grav Amplification stratagem, it's just such a good buff on Grav Devastators. I think Salamanders are a really decent choice as well. In their doctrine they could get +1 to wound for melters, and they could also use Crucible of Battle for +1 to wound on turn 1. Again, really good with grav cannons. If you wanted to have the scariest melter death around, you could throw in Vulcan with the multi-melter devs, though it is a bit annoying that you wouldn't be able to activate that buff on the turn that they come in, as it has to be done in the command phase now. They do also have a fire as if stationary stratagem too, and getting 1 extra reroll to wound on multi-melters is no bad thing from their chapter tactic. Another really solid option is Iron Hands. Their doctrine allows you to fire as if stationary and also reroll ones with heavy weapons. This one as a Devastator doctrine is even better as you get it turn 1, which is often where you're going to want to come in to deal the maximum damage as early as possible in the game. The Mercier's Weakness stratagem is really decent with grav cannons as well. If the whole squad targets down one thing, then any wound roll of 6 will cause an extra wound, which will equate to a 50% damage buff against any hard targets that you're shooting at, and still be very good against elite infantry and things. There are plenty of other options for other chapters. Space Wolves can ignore any to hit modifiers with a stratagem. Imperial Fists could ignore cover and get extra damage against vehicles with those multi-melters. And Deathwatch and Raven Guard are very interesting as they could allow you to ditch the drop pod altogether. If you do fancy it, there are various ways of putting them in outflank or deep strike reserve as well, and that would save you 70 points on the cost of the drop pod, although it would stop you from getting turn 1 deep strike. It'd be 1 command point each to put a Devastator squad in strategic reserve, and that would allow you to come in from the battlefield edges turn 2, or if you're Deathwatch or Raven Wing, then it could just be 1 command point per unit to either put them in the teleportarium or infiltrating off the board, and then come in literally anywhere on turn 2 or turn 3 as a very nice surprise firepower unit popping up with an ideal choice of targets. Finally, if you wanted to trade out your transport option, you could think about a Rhino or Razorback, which in some lists could make more sense. They are very tough, they'll actually be able to fall back if the enemy charges them, and they could actually meaningfully contribute to the battle rather than being a hindrance once it's down. So having talked through a bunch of combos, let's just briefly talk about their damage output. If we just took 5 grav Devastators in the Ultramarines list and dropped them down turn 2 when Signs of Guilliman is in effect, with no other buffs whatsoever, we average 8 dead Intercessors, or 3 dead Gravis Marines, or 8 wounds on a toughness 7 to 8 vehicle. Certainly going to be making a ton of their points cost back on the very drop, and very efficient indeed against 2 wound Space Marines. If you did go for that Seal of Oath though, then they're pretty much going to kill whatever they shoot at. With average rolling, it's around about 13 dead Intercessors, 6 dead Gravis Marines, or 16 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. Whatever you shoot at is really going to feel it. If we looked at the multi-melter Devastators, this time being a little bit braver with them, and we're going to try and drop them within 12 inches, you'd average 5 dead Gravis Armoured Space Marines, and a pretty crazy average roll of 27 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, meaning that you could certainly afford to split fire a bit if you were next to 2 of them, or around about 20 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle. The numbers aren't quite as ludicrous if you have to drop outside of 12-inch range, but you should still be odds on to gun down nearly any standard size vehicle in the game. So I do think that drop pod Devastators are an interesting and very usable choice for Codex Space Marines, though as is ever with Space Marines, they're facing stiff competition from other options. Anything with melter weapons these days is going to get compared to Eradicators, and compared with a squad of melter Devastators, they are somewhat tougher, they're more mobile, and after that Armorium Cherub has gone down, they will tend to have more damage output per point as well. The devs do win slightly though if you're combining the Signum with your Armorium Cherub. They don't have literally everything their way though. If you are wanting anti-tank threat as reserves, these guys will have to pay for a strategic reserve, so it's not as hard for your opponent to zone you out, and you're not getting in their turn 1. Their targeting is a bit more limited than the Devastators, due to them not being able to split fire if they want to fire their guns twice, and I find it very unlikely that they'll escape the next balance pass without a nerf to their points cost or abilities. Until that happens, I'm sure Eradicators will see far more competitive play, but I do think that the multi-melter Devastators can have their niche in certain chapters if you want them coming in from reserve. When comparing to Primaris equivalents, I'd argue that Plasma Inceptors are one of the best Primaris anti-elite killers, and like drop pod Devastators, they can come in from deep strike. The Inceptors are far more mobile and generally have a bit more damage output when they're overcharging, though it does depend on the exact target that they're shooting at. For example, those Ultramarine Grav Devastators will tend to do a little bit more point for point against most Space Marine infantry targets, provided the Inceptors aren't getting their blast rule on those Plasma Exterminators. The Devastators also have more range, and they don't try and cook themselves with their own plasma weapons, which you have a depressingly high chance of doing even if you have a reroll 1s on those Plasma Scepters. So overall, I would still say that the drop pod of Devastators can be a viable tactic in a Space Marine army, and in some cases could even be preferable to the very strong units of Eradicators or Plasma Interceptors in certain chapters such as Iron Hands, Ultramarines and Salamanders. I find them a really quite interesting unit. They do require some buffs to function properly, but in the right circumstances they're looking very scary indeed. They can be a big psychological blow to losing some key units right from turn 1, and having the slightly terrifying threat of a drop pod above their heads while they're deploying their valuable units. If you can think of any other ways to get more out of the drop pod strategy, please let me know down in the comments below. I certainly might have missed something across all of the many Space Marine codexes. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we have more 40k content coming pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been getting good value out of my videos, I would just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making so many videos a week does take quite a lot of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated to help keep them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description if you're interested. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.